Okay, so this is video one, which is all about gut health. Now, gut health is, I find, the cornerstone of health. It's because it's what happens first, what we ingest, what we put in. It's all that's what has to be dealt with. So it's all about optimizing the health of your gut. That's the main thing we're going to talk about here, and the potential problems, the pitfalls, the solutions that we can look at. Because once we identify any kind of problems and solutions, then you know what to do about it. And of course, it's not all about medication. Usually medication to do with the gut actually creates more problems than it solves. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So it's really about helping you make an informed choice and being aware, because this modern world is all about convenience, and we see that food is an inconvenience. We rush through meals. We don't think about what we do. We don't think about the chewing. We're not mindful of what we're doing. We're not experiencing it and thinking about how we are taking that time to nourish our bodies. It actually becomes a hindrance that we've got to get something out of the way, and we just rush in and just put some food in there to stop the hunger pangs. Now remember, hunger pangs are just body's signals to tell you to put something that it needs. So sometimes we don't hydrate enough, and that same sensations about eating really is about have more water, more fluids. So we've got to be aware of that to start. Plus the fact, if you're on the way back from a garage or something, on the train, you're hungry, you don't need to buy the crap on the shelf, because what's the worst that can happen? You're not going to die in the next 30 minutes. You're just have an automated response to a sensation, a signal in the body to do something, put something in your mouth. If we can bring back mindful eating and awareness of what we're doing, we'll realise that we're not going to keel over and die, and we're fine with it. So it's just about empowerment and being able to measure. This is what I want to look at with this. So I think something else to be aware of is that, I hear genetics being banded around a lot and the blame on genetics, but really genetics is all, genetic really just loads the gun, but it's the environment that we have and the things we create that pulls the trigger. And that's what we've got to remember. We can't just blame it on things. We have the ability to take control and take responsibility for what we put inside of us. And remember, the gut is the barrier to the outside world. It's the first line of defense. So if it's not healthy and it's poor and it's not doing its job, then we're more likely to get things like autoimmune diseases or pathogens getting in there and getting, bad stomachs or all that kind of nasty stuff. So we've got to really be aware of it and look after it, because autoimmune systems, 70% of autoimmune diseases, 70% of them are environmental things that we can do something about it, and like lifestyle stuff, emotional stress, all that kind of stuff. There's things that we can take charge of which we can reduce that. So bear that in mind, 70% of autoimmune diseases are environmental. And then, there's things like being able to connect the three-system triangle. The reason why I'm talking about gut health is because it has a real control and manipulation of the other systems. So this is why this comes first, I believe. So really that's where we're starting off. And so now we're just going to sort of get a better understanding of the gut, potential problems, and potential solutions. So, excuse me, I want to explain about the gut. The gut's sometimes called the second brain. Now, in the embryonic stage, when we're in development, when we're becoming humans, they're in the same place as the brain, and they're apart, but they still have the same amount of neurotransmitters, about 100 million. The brain has 100 million, the stomach has 100 million. The brain becomes the autonomic nervous system. The gut, the digestive system, becomes the enteric nervous system, and they can run independently. The gut can run by itself as long as it has a blood supply. It doesn't need the brain. It knows what it's doing. So that's why it's called the second brain. It can get that. But the thing is, as well, is 70% or 75% of our immune system is in the stomach. So it's not about being up here. It's down here. It has an immune response because of this being the first line of defense, protocol, whatever it is, when we start eating things. So this is very important to realize that we get to control that in any moment, or we don't. It's our choice. And because of that, we can then look at what we can do to prevent any kind of things that are coming in, and we can look at where hydrochloric acid is. If it's high, if it's low, that gets affected by emotional stress and all that kind of thing. So, the other thing as well, just talking about hydrochloric acids, so many people like pop antacids more than ever. But really, that's not usually the problem. Acid reflux is not usually high acid. It's the fact that it's a nervous system problem with the esophagus, the little, the flap of skin that controls, whether it goes into, we breathe or food goes into the stomach. So we've got to really be aware of that. And then the other thing as well about stress, when stress goes up and the hydrochloric acid goes down, so the strength of it goes down, so we get low acid, is the fact that hydrochloric acid, one of the things it does is it sterilizes food because it's so acidic that it kills pathogens, it kills parasites. But if we're constantly stressed, then that's less effective. And then of course that's a less breakdown of food, which then goes into the intestines, and then of course can cause autoimmune responses, which then lead to other diseases. So we've got to be very mindful of that, I think. So with that in mind, I just want to sort of talk about the transition, if you like. So usually food stays in the stomach 1 to 3 hours, depending on the type of food or the combination of foods. The transit time between eating foods and it coming out of our bum, our anus, is 12 to 16 hours ish. Now it does, if it's 11 hours or 17 hours, it doesn't matter. But there's a real, thought process of the fact that if we are not going, if we're going 24 hours without going to the toilet, then we've got a real issue where we can start having a reuptake or reabsorption of waste materials, which can cause its own issues. So if you're having problems going to the toilet, and it's more than 24 hours, then there's other things to look at and be aware of. Same for if it's, it's like 6 or 7 hours transit time from there. It's usually, that's when it becomes diarrhea, because it's not slow enough. It's not slow enough when we're in the large intestine. That's when we kind of dehydrate the waste matter and take that back into the body along with electrolytes and so energy for the large intestine to work. And if that's going through too quick, there's a problem there that's not working there as well. So if you think about how it starts, we put food in the mouth and we start chewing. We've got something called salivary amylase, which helps break down simple carbohydrates. So it kind of starts the digestion process in there. As well as that is, when it starts the digestion process down there, it kind of signals the brain to prepare the stomach to what kind of food is likely to come down. So it's very clever. And then in the stomach isn't where everything's absorbed, it's the start of the digestion process. So for example, it churns the food. There's 4 muscles in the stomach. It really rolls around to really break down proteins primarily, because protein's quite hard to digest. So we get something called pepsin, which is it's an enzyme which comes in, helps start breaking down and making the surface area of proteins bigger, so it's easier to digest. And then once we go from there, we go into the small intestine. And the small intestine really has kind of 3 parts to it, but I'll not really go into that because it's not really important. But in the top part of the small intestine, that's when the liver and the gallbladder get in, and we start putting bile in there, which emulsifies fats, which starts helping break down fats. And then once that's done, then you can start looking at breaking down the protein and the carbohydrates and the fats more, so we can sort of get the enzymes out there and get the enzymes to really break down this into its smallest possible parts, because then that makes it easier for absorption later. And then of course then we've got the large intestine, like I've mentioned already. It's mostly waste to be excreted, apart from with dehydrate and take the water and reabsorb the water in the body along with electrolytes and some enzymes, and that's basically the big that's basically what digestion is. I mean, the other thing about the gut is the fact that we have about 5 or 10 pounds of bacteria in our gut, and of course we've got that, it's what you call gut flora, and we've got that delicate balance of good and bad bacteria. This is why antibiotics aren't the best thing, because they don't just strip the bad bacteria out, they strip everything out, which then of course can then cause other issues and other infections, bacterial, yeast, fungal, that kind of stuff to take a hold, can certainly make things worse. And it's not so much taking probiotics, they're a thing, but it's they're like a symptom. They're relieving a symptom, if you like. They're not good or bad. It's just sometimes they don't need to be popping a pill every day. It's just I like to get down to the cause. So most likely when you get to the cause, then everything else starts to clear up, if that makes sense. So the gut and like good bacteria in the gut also helps deal with potential infections because it's antibacterial, it's antifungal. So it really helps crush all the bad nasties that exist in there. Helps metabolize food, helps synthesize vitamins and minerals. So it has an important role. And I know there's more bacteria in the stomach than there is cells in the body. So we've got something living in there doing its thing for us to keep us ticking along. So that's kind of the main function of the gut. And now really I just want to kind of talk through a bit more about, that's something I was going to say before I go there, is the fact that the digestive system is really three things. It's about digestion, which is about the stomach, then absorption, which is in the intestines, and then the excretion to get rid of the waste. And we really want to think about that, as I said earlier, about how we eat. Be mindful and slow things down and make an experience, because awareness always precedes change. Being aware and being in the moment when you're eating and not doing on the fly because it's just something you have to do because you've got a million other things to do. You need to really think that they're not important. Eating is, and being aware of what you're doing and then sensations and how your body reacts. That's when we can tune in, and that's how we can feel better about it. So potential problems, the three I always see are deficiencies, infections, and inflammation. Now they're all bad things that can have a big impact on our health. So let's start with deficiencies. Usually to do with we can have low hydrochloric acid. Low stomach acid usually is to do with stress. Stress is a major factor. If you think about the fight or flight response, if we're in stress, we're in fight or flight, so we're in the sympathetic nervous system. So that means that blood is drawn away from the stomach to the limbs, prepared to move or fight or escape to survive, and that just then can cause low stomach acid. Medications can cause low stomach acid. Currently to popular release, as I mentioned earlier, antacid's never the best thing to do because it's lowering stomach acid, because we think acid reflux is high, which from what I have researched and what I believe is the fact, it is something quite different. It's a nervous system thing, and we'll get to that in another video. So we've got to look at the fact that how can we bring ourselves back into the parasympathetic nervous system as much as possible, the rest and digest system. It's called rest and digest for a purpose. It allows us to rest properly, and it allows us to digest food properly. So the easiest way, and you know this already, is deep diaphragmatic breathing. If we practice this daily, and not just once, but anytime we feel any kind of stress, or even before we eat, to get into a balance, and our body's going to be better able to digest stuff, if that makes sense. Because obviously stress, it's a killer in every way, but it affects every system. And we don't want it to affect this, because this is where we are ingesting. But if we're not in the right place to digest, then, as I said before, larger particles of food not getting digested causes autoimmune issues down the line. So we've got to really be aware of that. Second one, infections. There's infections of the small intestine. SIBO, for example, is about bacterial overgrowth, and you can get infections in the large intestine. Both cause inflammation. Inflammation is then something that has a systemic effect on everything, and then that the immune response is looking at inflammation, and trying to reduce that. So we've got to be aware of that. Types of infection: bacterial, yeast infections, fungal infections caused by mold, for example, mold spores. So if you've got any damp in the house, make sure you get that sorted out. Parasitic infections as well. I think one thing to be aware of: parasites are everywhere. This is beyond the scope of this video, but we'll talk about parasites in another time. But if you think of what a parasite is, it's a host. It takes from the host and manipulates the host for its own gain. That's what a parasite is, and they live in different stages from being from a youth to an adult, if you like, and they are, what's the word, active and inactive in certain parts of their growth cycle. So sometimes when they're tested on, like doctors can test for parasites, but if they test in the wrong time, they're inactive and then they don't show up in a panel. So you've got to test them over like a number of days. And they can be in the body for a long time, and they can manipulate the body a long time. They can mimic diseases. So I've known of people who have had certain autoimmune diseases which really were parasitic infections. So we've got to be really mindful of that. The problem we've got is that doctors they haven't got the right testing for it. There's different testing procedures for that, which I'll talk about at the end. And it's something that's possible if if other things aren't addressing improving the gut. So all those kind of infections, they affect the inflammation, as I said. They, you increase inflammation. They affect the villi, the microvilli, the brush borders, which are all in the intestines. These are the things that allow the absorption. For example, celiac is usually when it flattens all the villi, and so you have very poor absorption, and it causes a lot of pain. So any kind of inflammation in those areas can cause increased mucus, which then affects the breakdown of food, which causes fermentation, which of course leads to gas, bloating, pain, distension, immune issues. So if you've got a lot of gas, it's usually because you're eating food that your body cannot digest or your body doesn't like. So be very mindful of that. If you're trumping a lot, it's usually because your body's not liking what you're doing, or your body's not in the best place to absorb or digest and absorb. So that's the really main thing. Those infections though as well, I always say be very aware of where you've been in the world. Third world countries especially. If you've ever had Delhi belly, if you've ever had been sick 48 hours, if you've ever had a lot of diarrhea or all three, there's a high likelihood that you've got some kind of infection there, and it's always wise to see whether that's something that needs to be cleared, because otherwise that can stay there for a long time if unresolved. So always be mindful of that. And the last one, inflammation. There's 3 kinds of inflammation brought from different things. You can get allergies, which are immediate, straight away. Intolerances, which usually over a 24-hour period, you have some kind of reaction. Sensitivities are the one that people really don't pick up on, because sensitivities can take 72 hours or 3 days to present after ingesting. So it's quite difficult to pinpoint what the problem is. So we do that in a number of ways. So things like inflammation can be caused by medication. It can be caused by alcohol, by drugs, by emotional stress, which also affects gut bacteria, the good and bad bacteria balance, which of course we've talked about that before, which can affect the immune system, the immune response, increase inflammation. So there's a lot of things that we need to be aware of. And because of that, this is why we get to be mindful. We remove stress before we're mindful in we're eating on our experience. These things are big things that we can do right now, straight away, that can have an effect. Other things that we can do to improve or reduce inflammation and just really get our gut health in a really good place is, first thing is an elimination diet, which is something we're going to look at in week 3. In week 4, I'm going to get you guys to look at this, and there's different levels that we can do. Don't need to talk about those straight away, because I'm going to do another video about the elimination diet further along. But it's about removing reactive foods, and so things that are really common at the moment, because we eat too much of them, is wheat, gluten, dairy, and soy. They're the main things that cause inflammation, and which can then knock off. If people have food allergy tests and all that kind of thing, sometimes testing presents other foods which aren't usually the problem, because our level of inflammation is higher than it should be. And so unless you know what you're doing and how to look for what's really the problem, then you're going to have an issue. So elimination diets are very simple to do, and it's always about getting back to basics, removing all reactive foods. And as I said, there's other things as well, like nightshades, grains. Everyone has a different reaction, and it doesn't have to be that necessarily you've got to remove them forever, but at that moment in time your body's got a level of inflammation and these foods are reacting to it, so it's best to remove them from the body for a period of time. And then what you do is you would reintroduce them and have a meal with one thing in, and then stop, and then wait a few days to see if anything reacted. Obviously the sensitivities take 3 days, so you test the food once you reintroduce and then see if there's an issue. If there's not, then your body should be okay with that. So that's like very basic stuff. And then the next thing is about a transition test, so we can see how long foods take to digest, and then we can see if there's issues, if it's too soon or too long. So the easiest way to do this without any kind of official testing is the beetroot test. If you take a cup of beetroot that's been cooked and eat it, because beetroot doesn't lose its colour during digestion and absorption, you should be able to see if you eat beetroot first thing in the morning, 12 to 16 hours later when you go to the toilet, you'll see red poo. And that means that you can see the transition time. Now, if we don't see that in 24 hours, 48 hours, then there's some reabsorption, reuptake there, and there's an issue that needs to be addressed. Same thing if it comes out too soon. We've got to look at why things aren't being digested in a slow manner and why it's going through. Sometimes that's to do with bacteria. Sometimes that's to do with pathogens that the body just wants to excrete. I get that. So there's different things to do. And then of course there's another test called the intestinal permeability test, and things like leaky gut, IBS, all these like leaky gut and IBS. These can cause things like brain fog, thyroid issues, joint issues, fatigue. There's lots of things that can present as, which then we get medication for, which has got nothing to do with that. And again, it's treating symptoms instead of finding out why. And then the last thing, oh yes, sorry, I've jumped in. I've said transition, which was the second and third thing was which was intestinal permeability test, but also stool testing. So we can actually do proper stool testing if the transition test is okay or not okay. So there's levels. The first thing I'd always look at is elimination, then a transition time test. Then if you want to actually have to go into actual testing, that will be a stool test, and there's good and bad tests for that as well. So I wouldn't just go to the cheap ones, because usually they're not very good. I was going to say shit there, but that's a bit of a pun. And then the intestinal permeability test. So that's in essence what I want to talk about with gut health. It's just something to consider with the digestion, the digestive system. The initial assessment sheet that I got you to do, there's different sections. The first 5 sections are to do with digestion. So A, we're looking at the, sorry, got something in my eye. The large intestine. So we're looking at the large intestine. So if high numbers, there's things that we need to look at. If in B, it's low stomach acid, and that of course causes its own issues. As I've said earlier, low stomach issues could be medication, could be stress. What kind of things can we look at there? And then C is high stomach acid. That's all about, if it's too high, why is it being caused? What's causing it to be high. D is the small intestine, and E is all about the liver, the gallbladder. It's all about digestion of fats and all that kind of stuff. So that's really what I want to talk about. The next thing I want to talk about in the next video is all about insulin and blood glucose management. They go together, so we're going to talk about that. If you've got any questions about this, of course, post below, because I'm sure there might be. And I'll catch you on the next video. See you later.